The house held a kind of stillness that didn't feel like rest. It felt more like hesitation, the way a man pauses before he opens a door he's not sure he wants to walk through. The faint hum of the refrigerator, the soft tick of the wall clock, even the wind brushing against the siding, all of it blended into a quiet that seemed too careful, too deliberate, as if the morning itself was holding something back. A thin draft slipped across the floor, cold enough to raise the small hairs along my ankle. I watched the windows slowly lighten, not with warmth, but with a dull, watery glow that made the kitchen look older than it was. Somewhere beyond the fence, a distant truck engine groaned awake, the low rumble stirring a memory of my father's long-haul days. Those sounds used to comfort me. That morning they didn't. I reached for the coffee mug I'd left on the counter and realized my hand was trembling just slightly. The kind of tremor born not from age, but from knowing something is shifting in your life long before you can name it. For days I'd felt that quiet pressure building, like weather turning behind closed clouds. A man can ignore many things, but not that. And then out of the stillness, a single vibration broke the air, short, sharp, insistent, pulling my attention toward the phone on the counter, glowing in the dim light. The call came while the morning was still quiet, a thin line of pale light just beginning to touch the edges of my kitchen window. I had not even taken a sip of the coffee cooling in my hand when the hospital number appeared on my phone. Something in me tightened before I answered, the kind of instinct a man develops only after life has taught him that bad news rarely asks permission to arrive. The nurse spoke with a careful steadiness, as if she understood that her words carried weight. Someone had attempted to change my father's financial access. She said he seemed confused during the conversation, unsure of what he had agreed to. There was a note in her voice, something soon but urgent, that made me set the coffee down and reach for my keys without thinking. The drive to my hometown stretched long and familiar. Snow clung to the shoulders of the road, and the mountains stood against the horizon like a silent reminder of everything I had left behind. I had made this drive before, in better times and in worse. But this time there was a heaviness in the air that made every mile feel sharper. At the hospital, the warmth inside felt heavy with the scent of disinfectant. My father sat near the window, his shoulders hunched slightly, as if the weight of the light itself was too much. He lifted his eyes when I stepped in, and for a moment I saw the man I grew up with, the one who taught me how to tie down a load, how to keep a clear head in a storm. But the look faded, replaced by a tired confusion that seemed to cling to him since the stroke. I asked how he was feeling. He gave a small shrug. He said he felt fine but could not remember much about the past few days. His voice drifted thin and uncertain, as if he was trying to catch a thought before it disappeared. Outside his room, the nurse guided me to a quieter part of the hallway. She explained that 2 people had tried to alter his financial permissions. When security reviewed the cameras, they saw only one man. He kept his face angled away, his hands gloved. She paused before adding one more detail. The man favored his left hand for everything he did. She said it almost like a question, as if waiting for my reaction. I thanked her. The detail sat in my mind like a weight. When I returned to the room, Mason was there. My half-brother stood stiffly by the bed, arms folded across his chest. He said he had helped Dad with a few papers recently. He said it quickly, without looking at either of us for long. Something about the way he shifted his gaze told me he had rehearsed his answer. I pressed him gently for more. He avoided the question with the same old impatience he carried since we were boys. Dad reached into the pocket of his jacket and pulled out a small sealed envelope. His hands trembled as he placed it in mine. Across the front, in a shaky scrawl, were the words, "Open only if something goes wrong." He watched me with uncertainty, as if he feared the message hid something he no longer remembered. He said he did not recall writing it. There was a quiet shame in his tone, a kind of apology that a father should never have to make. Mason muttered that he had errands to run and walked out. His footsteps faded down the hall. I stood there for a moment, feeling the envelope warm in my palm. It felt heavier than it should, like it carried the echo of a warning he had tried to give, before his memory began slipping away. As I sat beside my father, he reached for the cup of water on the table. His hand shook lightly. I steadied it for him, and the gesture brought back a memory of him steadying my handlebars the day I learned to ride a bike on the long gravel road behind our house. He let go too early. I told him he should have held on longer, and he laughed that low laugh of his and said a boy needed to learn balance sooner or later. The memory stayed for a moment warm and distant, before fading back into the cold hospital room. After we talked for a while, I stepped outside to clear my head. The winter air hit hard, sharp enough to pull a breath from my chest. The parking lot stretched silent under a pale sky. Snow crunched under my boots as I stood there, letting the cold settle my thoughts. Something felt wrong beneath the surface of everything I had just seen: the strained explanations, the man on the camera hiding his face, the envelope my father did not even remember writing. I knew the signs. My work had taught me that exploitation rarely looked like a crime from the start. It usually looked like help. Help that arrived too quickly, stayed too long, and asked too many questions that the vulnerable person could not answer. I slipped the envelope into my jacket pocket and stared across the lot. A single crow perched on a lamppost, its feathers ruffled by the wind, watching the empty road. In that moment, I understood that I had not come home for a casual visit. I had come because something was unfolding around my father. Something calculated and quiet, something that depended on him being too tired and too confused to resist. And for the first time in a long time, I felt the old instinct rise in me. The one that had carried me through long nights of investigations and days spent piecing together truths no one wanted uncovered. Someone believed my father was helpless. Someone believed no one would come back for him. As I stood there in the cold Montana air, I knew they were wrong. The house felt colder than the air outside when I stepped through the door, as if time had been slipping through the cracks while no one noticed. The afternoon light slanted across the living room floor, catching dust in a slow drift. My father stood near the couch, one hand resting on the armrest for balance, the motion careful and deliberate. It struck me how different he looked in his own home, like a man walking through a place he recognized but no longer commanded. He took a step toward me, then stopped to steady himself. His hand trembled faintly as he reached for a stack of mail on the front table. I moved to help, but he lifted a hand to show he could manage. He opened an envelope and stared at the page inside with a puzzled frown, lips moving as he tried to make sense of the printed lines. After a moment, his shoulders dropped and he held the paper out to me. "Too much of this," he said softly. "My head cannot keep up the way it used to." The words landed heavier than they should have. This was the man who once overhauled a diesel engine by feel alone, who guided a 16-wheeler across 5 states without a map, who could calculate fuel mileage in his head while eating a sandwich at a rest stop. Seeing him lost in a piece of mail felt like watching a familiar mountain lose its shape in a storm. Mason came out of the kitchen with a mug in his hand. He nodded at me, then at the mail. I told him I would take care of all that, he said, brushing past me to gather the envelopes. He talks himself in circles these days. Someone needs to keep things straight. There was something in his tone, not concern, not frustration, but a quiet claim over territory that was not his. He moved through the house with the confidence of a man who believed he had already been appointed guardian, never mind the paperwork or the law. Dad sank into his recliner and watched him with a tired expression. The kind you see on men who have spent too many years trying to keep peace in a house full of louder voices. Mason walked with familiar ease, opening drawers, shifting things around, leaving that silent message that he was the one in control now. An hour later, there was a knock on the door. I opened it and found Derek Maddox standing there with a polite smile and a folder tucked under his arm. He stepped inside like a man who had already been here too many times. He shook my hand and said he had been helping Dad reorganize a few financial matters. His voice carried that smooth confidence common among insurance brokers, a rehearsed ease that slid into every sentence. While he talked, his eyes scanned the room with the quiet calculation of someone measuring the ground beneath his feet. He laid a folder on the kitchen table, flipping through pages as if giving a presentation. His words flowed steadily. Protection, coverage, planning ahead. He spoke with the calm authority of a man used to convincing people who did not fully understand what they were signing. Dad stood nearby trying to follow, his brow furrowed when the numbers piled too quickly on the page. Derek pointed at one document as if it were the most natural thing in the world. "This one is especially helpful," he said, tapping the paper with a practiced gesture. Long-term stability. Something in the way he spoke caught my attention. He mentioned a transaction amount that only someone with access to my father's accounts would know. The details slipped out lightly, almost casually, but it glowed like a warning flare in my mind. After Derek left, I took the folder to the small back room, the one that once held my childhood posters and a twin bed. The desk was buried under receipts, envelopes, and overdue notices. I sat down and began sorting through them with the methodical calm that years of forensic work had drilled into me. Halfway through the stack, my fingers stopped on a glossy document. A life insurance policy. $2 million recently issued. My father listed as the insured. Beneficiaries Mason Harlan and Derek Maddox. My breath slowed. The room seemed to lean inward, narrowing around the page in my hand. I read it again, tracing the signature at the bottom. It looked like Dad's handwriting, but the tremor was unmistakable. The kind of tremor that came after the stroke. The kind of tremor that appeared when someone guided his hand across a line. The weight of that signature settled in my chest. I took the policy into the living room. Dad was resting with his eyes half closed. I sat down next to him and held the paper where he could see it. "You remember signing this?" He stared at the page for a long moment. His eyes moved slowly, searching for familiarity. He looked lost. "That the medical thing," he said weakly. "Derek said it would help with hospital bills." The honesty in his voice was worse than any lie would have been. Linda came home a little before dusk. She set the grocery bags down and froze when she saw the folders spread across the table. She walked over slowly, wiping her hands on her jacket. "You going through all that tonight?" she asked. "Someone should," I said. She sat down across from me, the dim light catching the worry in her face. When I asked how often Mason had been taking Dad to appointments, she hesitated. "Pretty often," she said. It all looked official. Banks, finance people. I did not understand half of it. I trusted him to manage things. I thought he was stepping up. Her voice wavered just barely. I asked if anything had felt off. She looked down at her hands. "Sometimes I saw your father come home looking tired, more tired than usual. I did not know what to say. I thought if I pushed too hard, it would make things worse between them. I just wanted the house to stay calm." Those few words revealed more than she intended. When she left to make dinner, I returned to the statements. The pattern became clear. Small withdrawals always below a threshold that would trigger questions. The kind of theft that grows slowly, built on the assumption that no one will look closely. Dad shuffled into the doorway. He watched me with a gentle sadness. I used to keep everything in a metal box, he said. Simple and safe. Now people hand me pages and tell me where to sign. I cannot argue anymore. He sat down at the table, the last of the daylight falling across his hands. The fading light revealed the fine tremor in his fingers, and I remembered those same hands gripping a wrench with absolute certainty, guiding me through fixing my first engine steady and sure. Now they rested lightly on papers that no longer belonged to him, surrounded by decisions he could not defend himself against. Somewhere in the hallway, Mason's voice rose in a muted conversation on the phone. The words were unclear, but the tone was sharp, restless. I stayed seated, watching my father in the quiet room as the day slipped into evening. The overhead light flickered on, casting a pale glow across the table and the documents that had rewritten the balance of his life. He breathed slowly, eyes lowered, as if listening for something he could no longer name. The last trace of daylight faded, leaving only the hum of the old refrigerator and the soft rustle of the papers between us. The night settled over the house without ceremony, the way winter nights often do in Montana, quiet and heavy. I sat at the kitchen table with the last of the daylight gone, the overhead bulb casting a pale circle across the spread of documents. The paper felt cool beneath my fingertips, lined up like faint echoes of choices my father never truly made. I pulled the life insurance policy closer, setting it beside a bank statement dated 3 months earlier. The numbers told a story, one that did not match the slow, trembling man I had watched struggle with a simple envelope. I let my breath settle and began reading the fine print with the calm focus I had learned over years of forensic work. Somewhere in the stillness, I felt myself shift from son to investigator. The signature date on the $2 million policy stopped me cold. It matched the day my father was in the hospital after the stroke, barely awake, drifting in and out as nurses adjusted his medications. I remembered visiting him that evening. He could not even hold a cup without spilling water across the sheets. The idea of him signing anything on that day felt absurd. I lifted the page closer to the light. The pressure points in the signature were uneven, the way they often are when a hand guides another hand across paper. I placed it side by side with older documents he had signed before the stroke. The difference was unmistakable. The man who signed the policy had not been capable of writing his own name, let alone understanding the meaning behind it. As I flipped to the next page, my thumb brushed a dark smudge along the corner. It was faint but familiar. Coffee. The kind that leaves a thin shell of instant powder when stirred too quickly. I had seen that same stain on Derek's sleeve earlier. The same pattern of rushed mornings and cheap caffeine. For a moment, the kitchen felt smaller, as if the walls leaned in to listen. A car passed outside, its headlights sweeping across the front windows. I gathered the papers, slid them into a folder, and tucked the folder under my arm. The house felt tense around me, every creak of the floorboards holding something unspoken. My father had already gone to bed. Linda was washing dishes, slowly lost in her thoughts. Mason was nowhere to be seen. I stepped out into the cold night and locked the truck door behind me. The air smelled of wood smoke drifting from chimneys along the street. I drove toward town, the road empty except for the soft glow of the gas station at the corner. My thoughts moved with the rhythm of the yellow lines passing under the headlights. Samuel Ridley's office sat above a hardware store, its windows lit by a single desk lamp that burned late most nights. Sam was the kind of man who carried his calm the way others carried a badge. When I knocked, he opened the door without surprise, as if he had been expecting me. He motioned me in and waited while I set the folder on his desk. I watched his eyes move across the pages with steady focus. He flipped from one document to the next, pausing at the signature, then at the dates, then at the coffee stain. He leaned back after the last page, rubbing a hand across his jaw. "This is elder financial exploitation," he said quietly. No question. His words were simple but final, the kind of truth a man does not say unless he is sure. Sam reached for his phone and dialed someone from memory. He did not explain, only listened. Then he nodded once and hung up. "Dana Whitlock will meet us tomorrow," he said. "She has seen this pattern before, seniors signing documents they do not understand." Beneficiaries moved around like poker chips. It rarely starts this clean. Usually someone builds trust first, then moves money in small steps. I thought of Derek at the kitchen table. I thought of Mason standing over Dad's shoulder, finishing his sentences before he could think them through. Sam studied me for a moment. "There is more here," he said. "This did not begin last week." His words settled heavily into the room. When I stepped outside, the street was silent except for a neon sign humming across the road. I leaned against the truck and opened my phone, scrolling through county public records. A familiar name appeared on the list of petitions submitted months earlier. Mason Harlan. Petition for conservatorship of Harold Harlan. Filed 91 days ago. I stared at the screen as the cold seeped through my jacket. Mason had already made his move long before the stroke, long before any of us knew something was shifting in Dad's life. He had not said a word about it, not to me, not to Dad, not to Linda. The petition had been withdrawn 2 weeks after it was filed. The timing matched the date the life insurance policy was issued. Whatever plans Mason had, they had changed, or evolved. The idea tightened around my chest. This was not mismanagement, this was preparation. I drove home slowly, letting the heater push back the cold. Snowflakes drifted across the windshield like scattered ash. When I stepped back into the house, the lights were dim and the rooms were quiet. Linda had gone upstairs. The only sound was the low hum of the refrigerator and the faint ticking of the clock on the wall. I set the folder on the table and rested my hand on it. The papers inside were no longer just numbers and signatures, they were signals. They were the shape of something deliberate and calculated, something that required my father to stay quiet and trusting and unaware. I turned off the kitchen light, leaving the folder in the soft glow coming from the hallway. For a long moment I stood there, listening to the silence of the house, the weight of everything still hidden pressing against the walls. The truth had begun to move, and with every step I took, it moved with me. Morning came in through the kitchen window as a thin gray wash, turning the table into a flat sheet of light where the folder still rested. I had not slept much. Paper and ink were one thing. People hiding behind them were another. By 8, I was back at the hospital. The receptionist recognized me and nodded with that mixture of sympathy and caution people use around worried family. The head of security met me in a small office behind the main desk. The room smelled like old coffee and dust from overworked vents. A monitor sat on the desk, frozen on a frame from the previous week. He ran the footage again, letting the grainy image move across the screen. A man stepped into the frame near the nurse's station, shoulders slightly hunched, a dark cap pulled low. The angle hid most of his face, but his body told its own story. Taller than Mason by a few inches, narrower through the shoulders. Every movement was familiar to me in a way that did not fit my brother. The man signed a clipboard with his left hand, the pen held with quick practice strokes. I watched that detail again, the way his wrist turned, the natural ease of it. Mason had always been right-handed. I had seen him play ball, eat right, all of it with the same side. This was someone else. "That is the man who said he was assisting your father," the security chief said quietly. He presented some paperwork. It looked legitimate at the time. I studied the frame once more, then nodded. It was not my brother, which meant someone had walked into this building prepared to act in his place, or at least alongside him. On the drive back, I kept seeing that left hand move across the page. A memory surfaced, small but sharp. A family barbecue years ago. Derek had shown up with his older brother, Cliff. Cliff spent half the afternoon near the cooler, left hand always occupied, flicking a bottle cap, tapping the side of a plastic cup like he needed something to do with it. I had not thought about him in years. Back at the house, I sat at the table and opened my laptop. A search for Cliff Maddox brought up a thin record. Once employed at a regional insurance office in Billings. Terminated 4 years earlier. Internal review for irregular client files. No charges, no follow-up. Just a line that ended where a new one never began. It fit too well to ignore. Derek knew the insurance world from the front end, the sales side. Cliff would have known it from the inside out, the quiet corridors where policies were processed and signatures were filed away. Together, they would understand both doors. The one a customer walked through willingly, the one they never saw. In the early afternoon, I stepped outside to clear my head. The cold bit at my cheeks. Across the street, Maggie Doyle was standing on her porch coat, pulled tight grocery bag at her feet. She watched me for a moment, then lifted a hand and motioned me over. Her house smelled like old wood, stronger coffee than mine, and the faint perfume of someone who grew up in another decade and never saw a reason to change brands. She led me to a small dining room where a laptop sat open on the table. I heard raised voices the other week, she said, sitting down slowly, from your father's place. It stuck with me. I have seen enough families fall apart in courtrooms to know the sound of trouble. So I started my own little habit. When something feels wrong, I record it. She clicked a file on the screen and leaned back. The audio that came through was muffled but clear enough. I recognized Mason's voice, sharp with frustration. He was saying that Dad had signed, that all they needed now was time. The words came out low and tense, time for what was not said out loud. But the silence after made it plain. Under his voice, another thread, softer but insistent. A second man urging him to move quicker, saying bills were piling up, that they could not drag this out. I closed my eyes and listened again, focusing on that second tone. Derek had a way of dropping his words slightly at the end of a sentence, as though every statement was a step down into something private. That same cadence was there, threaded through the background, trying to keep Mason on track. When the recording ended, Maggie folded her hands together. I also received a letter, she said. No return address, just a message telling me to mind my own business. Said this was family and I should not meddle. She pushed an envelope across the table. The paper was cheap, the writing printed in block letters, the kind of careful disguise people adopt when they want to erase themselves. There was no threat spelled out, but the intention was clear enough. Stay quiet. And yet here you are, I said. She looked at me almost sharply, the way a retired court clerk might look at a witness who had an answer but did not want to give it. I have watched your father shovel his own walk for 20 winters, she said. I watched him help neighbors with broken fences and dead batteries. He is not perfect, but he is not a man who deserves to be pushed out of his own life. That is enough for me. I nodded. Gratitude was too small a word for what I felt, so I let the silence carry it. On the way back to my truck, the air felt thinner. The picture was starting to form, each piece sliding into place whether I was ready for it or not. At home, I listened to the recording again, this time through a set of old headphones in the back room. Mason's voice heated and restless. Derek's controlled but strained, pushing for speed. That single word time held in the space between them like a bargain neither wanted to examine too closely. I thought of Cliff in that hospital hallway, left-handed face turned away from the camera. I thought of Derek at the kitchen table, his coffee stain marking my father's policy. I thought of Mason standing over Dad with that new and undeserved authority, 3 men, each with their own reasons: money owed, pride wounded, opportunities seen where there should have been respect. None of them alone could have gotten this far. My father's confusion had not been an accident they took advantage of once. It had been the condition their plan required. The house was quiet. Dad was asleep upstairs, his breathing a faint rhythm through the old vents. Linda moved softly in the hallway, turning off lights one by one. Somewhere in the distance a dog barked and then gave up. I sat at the kitchen table with the laptop closed and the envelope from Maggie beside it. The recording, the hospital footage, the employment record, the petition for conservatorship, the policy with 2 names that did not belong there. They all pointed the same way. This was not simple greed. It was a structure, a network built from desperation and justified by the lie that an old man no longer needed control over his own life. I reached over and flipped off the overhead light, leaving the room in the muted glow from the street lamp outside. The shapes of the chairs and tables settled into shadow. For a moment I stood there listening to the quiet, aware of the weight of 3 men moving unseen around my father. Then I turned toward the dark hallway, knowing that whatever came next would pull every hidden thing into the open. The house was quiet when I stepped back inside, the kind of quiet that settles after a long day of holding too many truths at once. A thin line of light from the hallway stretched across the living room floor, falling toward the recliner where my father sat with a blanket over his knees. He looked up when he heard me, his face soft in the dimness as if he had been waiting without wanting to admit it. I walked in slowly and took the seat across from him. For a while, neither of us spoke. The clock on the wall ticked in that heavy, uneven rhythm it had carried since I was a kid. Dad's eyes drifted toward the front window, following nothing in particular. His hands were folded tightly together, knuckles pale. Some nights I hear him get angry for no reason, he said in a low voice. Not all the time. Just when the house is too quiet, he would ask me why I do not understand simple things anymore. His shoulders tensed as if the memory still pressed on him. I waited, letting the silence make space for whatever came next. I tried to tell him I did not know what the papers meant, Dad said. I told him to slow down, but he would raise his voice. Sometimes he grabbed the back of the chair so hard it shook. I did not want trouble. I signed because it was easier than fighting. He rubbed his thumb against his palm as if trying to erase the moments he had just described. It hurt to see fear in a man who had once stood unshaken through things far harder than this. After a long pause, he looked at me again. I did not want you to see me like that, he whispered. I leaned forward, resting my forearms on my knees. Dad, you do not have to hide anything from me. He smiled faintly, but the sadness stayed. Linda walked in from the kitchen, drying her hands on a towel. She hesitated when she saw us, then sat down on the edge of the couch as if deciding something in her mind. I should have said something sooner, she murmured. I saw Mason pushing too hard. I saw the way he talked to your father, but every time I tried to speak up, it felt like the whole house tightened. He would glare at me, and I thought if I pushed back, the piece we had left would break apart. Her voice caught on the last words. She set the towel on her lap and kept her eyes on it. I asked her how long she had noticed the change. A while, she admitted. But I kept telling myself it was just stress. I did not know things had gone this far. Dad reached for her hand, but she pulled it back gently, wiping her eyes before she let him take it. I could see the guilt sitting on her like extra weight. Later that night, after they had gone upstairs, I sat alone at the kitchen table. The envelope Dad had given me earlier sat unopened beside the stack of documents. I picked it up, feeling the worn paper under my fingertips. The handwriting across the front trembled, the letters leaning into one another like they needed support. I broke the seal and unfolded the pages inside. The paper was yellowed along the edges, softer than the newer sheets around it. The words were written in my mother's hand. The ink a little faded. She had always written like she spoke, neat and steady, every line carrying intent. The letter was not finished. Sentences cut off halfway, thoughts that trailed into blank space. She wrote about her worry after watching Mason struggle with his own insecurities even when he was young. She wrote about how she feared those insecurities would twist into something sharper if he ever felt threatened or overshadowed. She asked my father to be gentle but not blind, to guide him without letting him take too much. There was a line near the bottom, short but clear. She wrote that love does not excuse harm and that protecting one person cannot mean sacrificing another. I felt something loosen in my chest and tighten at the same time. She had seen this coming long before any of us had the courage to name it. I folded the letter carefully and set it on the table. The house felt different now, filled with echoes of things long whispered but never spoken aloud. I leaned back in the chair and let my eyes wander across the room, letting old memories surface. I remembered the afternoons when Mason would watch Dad teach me how to drive the old truck. He would stand off to the side, arms crossed, jaw tight, even though Dad tried to include him. I remembered the way he flinched when I succeeded at something he failed at. The quiet resentment that grew like a weed between us. Dad had tried to balance it all, but he was only one man and some storms live too deep in a person to be calmed by fairness. The truth settled around me, slow and heavy. My distance over the years, all the places I had gone to escape this town, had left open space for someone else to fill. Space Mason had taken with his own brand of authority. Space Derek had filled with plans and paperwork. Space my father had not known how to protect. Dad came down the stairs again a little later, wearing an old sweater and moving with care. He paused when he reached the bottom and looked at me as if deciding whether to speak. "I should have told you everything sooner," he said. "But you had your own life. I did not want to burden you with whatever this was becoming." I stood and met him halfway across the room. "You were never a burden, Dad." He nodded slowly as if he wanted to believe it but was not sure he deserved to. His eyes looked tired, but there was a flicker of the man I grew up knowing, the man who once carried more weight than anyone realized. He placed a hand on my shoulder for a moment, then let go and shuffled back toward the stairs. His footsteps were soft, unsteady, but steady enough. When the house went quiet again, I sat by the window and looked out at the street. The porch light cast a small circle on the snow, catching flakes that drifted sideways on the wind. Everything felt still, held in a long breath before the next shift. I closed the curtains and turned off the lamp, leaving the room in half darkness. My hand brushed the envelope on the table as I walked past it. The paper was cool now, the ink dark against the dim light. Upstairs, Dad's door closed softly. Linda's footsteps moved across the hallway. The clock downstairs ticked on, steady and slow. In that hush, I made a quiet promise to myself, one that needed no words. I would not let my father's life shrink into fear again. Not while I was still here to stand between him and the men who saw him as nothing more than an opportunity waiting to be taken. The house settled around me, carrying that vow into the dark. The county courthouse waited at the end of Main Street, its stone steps dusted with a light layer of snow that no one had bothered to clear yet. The sky was a flat gray above it, the kind that made everything look a little washed out. Inside, the heat hummed through old vents, and the air smelled of paper polish and long arguments. Dad sat beside me on a wooden bench in the hallway outside the courtroom, his hands folded in his lap. He wore the same dark jacket he had used for weddings and graduations, the fabric now a little shiny at the elbows. His eyes moved slowly over the people passing by, the lawyers with arms full of files, the clerks with clipboards, the few families waiting for their own turn under the fluorescent lights. "You sure you want me in there?" he asked quietly. I looked at him, at the lines around his mouth, at the effort it took to sit up straight. "You deserve to hear what they have been doing," I said, "and you deserve to be seen." He nodded and took a slow breath. The door at the end of the hall opened and Sam stepped out. His tie slightly loosened a folder in his hand. He gave us both a brief nod. "They are ready for us," he said. "Stay calm. The facts are on our side." We walked into the courtroom together. The room was smaller than the ones I had seen in bigger cities, but it carried the same weight. Flags at the front seal on the wall, the bench slightly raised. The judge sat with a neutral expression, studying the file in front of her. Mason was already there at the table opposite us, his shoulders tight, jaw set. Derek sat beside him, trying to appear resolute. His eyes kept darting around the room, searching for exits that did not exist. There was another man sitting behind them, maybe a local attorney they had found in a hurry. Dad and I took our seats at the table with Sam. Sam rose when the judge entered. We all did. The room settled into an expectant quiet. "This is a temporary hearing," the judge said, her voice steady. "We are here to determine the question of conservatorship over Mr. Harold Harlan, and to address allegations of financial misconduct." She invited Mason's side to speak first. Mason stood, cleared his throat, and glanced at the paper in front of him. "Your Honor," he began, "my father has been declining for some time. I have been the one taking care of his appointments, his bills, his day-to-day needs. I filed for conservatorship because I believed it was necessary. There has been some misunderstanding about his finances, but I can explain." His voice tried for calm, but it carried a defensive edge. The judge listened without reaction. An attorney beside him placed a small device on the table and pressed a button. A recording played through the speakers, slightly muffled. It was my father's voice, thin and tired. He was saying something about trusting Mason with decisions, about not wanting to think about money anymore. On the recording, it sounded like consent, like a man handing over his life with a willing heart. The attorney stopped the playback and spoke. "As you can hear," he said, "Mr. Harlan verbally agreed to transfer financial control. We have this and other recordings to show that my client was acting with permission." Sam did not move for a moment. Then he stood, opened his folder, and walked toward the bench with a calm that slowed the room. "Your Honor," he said, "that clip is one segment of a longer recording. My client's son has omitted key portions. We have submitted a full forensic audio report to the court in advance. With your permission, I would like to call the expert who prepared it." A woman in a gray suit came forward. She spoke clearly. The recording had been edited, sentences cut, pauses shortened, sections removed. The part where Dad said he did not understand what he was agreeing to was gone. The part where Mason raised his voice and insisted anyway was gone. The judge listened, brows drawn closer now, as the expert pointed out the digital fingerprints of each cut. When she finished, the judge turned back to Mason's attorney. "Do you have an unaltered version of this audio?" she asked. The attorney hesitated, then admitted he did not. Mason shifted in his seat, sweat starting to gather at his hairline. Sam returned to our table, then called Derek to the stand. Derek walked up with the half-confident stride of a man used to fronting more than he can cover. He swore in and sat down. Sam began quietly. "Mr. Maddox, you are an insurance broker, is that right?" "Yes." "You have been working with Harold Harlan for how long?" "A little over a year," Derek replied. "And during that time, did you help him obtain a life insurance policy in the amount of $2 million? "Yes, he wanted to protect his family." Sam nodded as if that answer was expected. "Were you aware that on the date he allegedly signed that policy, Mr. Harlan was in the hospital recovering from a stroke, unable to hold a cup by himself?" Derek hesitated. His eyes flicked toward Mason, then back. "I did not know the exact timing," he said. "That is what the paperwork shows." Sam held up a copy of the hospital record and the policy side by side. "The dates are identical," he said. "And you were listed as a beneficiary along with Mr. Mason Harlan. Can you explain why you as the broker were included to receive funds upon Mr. Harlan's death?" Derek swallowed. The quiet in the room grew heavier. "It was an arrangement," he said slowly. Mason insisted. "I was just helping." The judge leaned slightly forward. "Mr. Maddox," she said, "be very careful with your answers." Under that gaze, something in Derek shifted. Self-preservation overrode loyalty. "Mason came to me," he said quickly. "He wanted to set it up that way, said his father owed him. He asked me to structure it. I did not force anything. It was his idea." Mason turned on him, eyes wide, but Sam was already moving. "So you are saying Mr. Harlan's son initiated this plan?" Sam asked, "and that you went along with it?" Derek nodded, the words out now, the path chosen. Sam then called the next witness, a man in a dark suit, clean-cut, with the kind of tired eyes that see numbers and patterns all day. Gerald Statham introduced himself as Director of Insurance Fraud Compliance for a regional office. He spoke calmly, no drama, just facts. Derek had appeared on an internal watch list more than once. Unusual beneficiary structures. Policies taken out on older clients with sudden health events. Small complaints that never quite made it to court, but enough to raise concern. "We were reviewing his cases," Gerald said, "but nothing had yet risen to the level of formal prosecution. This case changes that assessment." He stepped down and Dana took his place. She looked at my father for a brief moment before focusing on the judge. She laid out what Adult Protective Services had found. The pattern of withdrawals, the pressure in the home, the altered recordings, the sudden appearance of a large policy naming the son and an unrelated broker as beneficiaries. "In our assessment," she said, "Mr. Harlan was targeted due to his age, his cognitive vulnerability, and his trust in his family member. He did not have the capacity to understand the documents he signed, nor were those documents explained to him in a meaningful way." Her words landed in the room like markers on a map, each point connected to the next. Mason was called to the stand. He walked with stiff movements, jaw clenched, eyes bright with anger and fear. Under questioning, his answers came out sharp and defensive. When Sam asked how he had accessed Dad's accounts, he slipped. "I had his login," he snapped. He never could remember his passwords anymore. Someone had to take charge. "So you entered his accounts yourself," Sam said, "without his active involvement." "Someone had to," Mason repeated, his voice rising. He was not going to do it. He did not know what he was doing. "I was the only one handling things." He seemed to hear his own words a split second too late. The judge watched him, her face unreadable. She sat back, looked over her notes, and then spoke. "At this time," she said, "the court finds that there is sufficient concern regarding undue influence and possible exploitation. The petition for conservatorship by Mr. Mason Harlan is revoked. All disputed financial activity is to be frozen pending further investigation." For a moment, the sound in the room faded. I felt my father beside me draw in a breath. His shoulders, which had been tight and slightly hunched all morning, dropped just a little. It was a small movement, but I felt it like a shift in the floor beneath us. The judge continued with procedural instructions, dates, and next steps, but my attention stayed on the man sitting to my right. His hands rested open on his knees now instead of clenched together. The strain around his mouth eased. When the hearing adjourned, we stood. Mason avoided my eyes, his face a mix of rage and something much closer to fear. Derek stared at the table as if the grain in the wood might offer him an escape route. Dad and I walked out into the hallway slowly. The fluorescent lights hummed overhead. People brushed past us to their own lives, their own troubles, unaware of the quiet victory that had just taken place. I glanced at him. There was no triumph in his expression, just relief and something like disbelief. We stepped outside together. The cold air met us clean and sharp. For the first time in a long while, my father stood a little straighter at my side. He looked at the courthouse behind us, then at the street ahead. He did not say anything. He did not need to. The wind moved through the bare branches above us, carrying away the last echoes of the words spoken inside. The cold settled deeper as we stepped away from the courthouse, a quiet breath of winter following us down the stone steps. Dad paused beside the truck, his shoulders easing in a way I had not seen for months. The wind carried the last faint sound of doors closing behind us, and for a moment neither of us moved. It felt like the world had finally loosened its grip. 2 mornings later, I saw the patrol car turn onto our street. The tires rolled slowly over the thin crust of snow, stopping in front of the small rental where Derek had been staying. I watched from the window as the deputies knocked, waited, and then walked him out, with practiced calm. His hands were cuffed, his head lowered. He tried to speak, but no one answered him. The door closed him into the back seat with a quiet finality. That afternoon, Sam confirmed the charges: fraud, identity manipulation, elder exploitation. Words that felt heavy but right. The system had finally taken its first step toward catching up with what had been done. Mason did not come to the house again. His silence was louder than anything he could have said. Later that week, the notice of charges reached him along with the restraining order: forgery, coercion, unauthorized access to Dad's accounts. I imagined him in some worn-out room gripping the papers that shattered the story he had told himself for years. Dana arrived with the final APS report a few days later. She sat with us at the kitchen table, the same place where so much confusion had piled up in the weeks before. She walked us through every page with a subtle but steady voice. The report confirmed everything: vulnerability, manipulation, coerced signatures, emotional pressure inside the home. There was no anger in her words, only truth arranged in a way no one could deny. When she left, Dad stayed at the table. His hand rested on the file. "So it was real," he said quietly, "all of it." I took the chair beside him, letting the silence settle around us. That evening, while he rested in his room, I went upstairs to look for a missing bill among the drawers in his office. The room smelled faintly of motor oil from the old jackets he still kept in the closet. Inside the desk, behind loose papers and clipped receipts, I found a folded yellow legal pad. My name was written at the top in his handwriting. I sat on the bed and opened it. The words moved slowly across the page, uneven in places, as if he had started and stopped many times. He wrote about the years when Mason and I were boys, how he had tried to balance us even when it was clear one carried storms he could not calm. He wrote about the resentment he had seen growing in Mason, the quiet, cutting kind that comes from feeling overshadowed. He apologized for not stopping it sooner. Apologized for the times he let my silence be misread as distance, for letting me carry the weight of leaving this town alone. The letter ended in the middle of a sentence, a thought half formed, a truth he had tried to give but never finished. I folded the pages gently and set them back in the drawer. Some words, even unfinished, carry all the meaning they need. Downstairs, I found Linda standing at the sink with the water running. Her hands were still, her shoulders drawn in. She did not turn when I entered, but I could see her reflection faintly in the darkened window. I reached past her and turned off the tap. She stayed, staring forward. "I thought if I kept things calm," she said softly, her voice tight around the edges. "I thought if I stayed quiet, it would help hold the house together. I was wrong." She pressed a hand against her chest as if steadying something inside. I knew he was losing ground to Mason's temper. I saw how he flinched sometimes when Mason walked into the room, but I kept thinking silence was safer than truth. I thought it was my job to keep the peace. A small tremor passed through her words. I failed him. I failed both of you. I stood beside her without speaking. There was nothing to undo what had already happened. Sometimes all a person needs is someone who will remain standing next to them without asking for excuses. The following morning, when the sky had cleared into a sharp winter blue, I asked Dad if he wanted to ride out to the old garage. He hesitated, then nodded with a faint spark that had been missing from his eyes. The garage sat at the edge of town, the metal siding weathered by decades of work and cold seasons. The side door creaked when I pushed it open, the sound familiar enough to feel like memory. Light streamed through narrow windows high on the wall, cutting through the dust hanging in the air. Dad stepped inside and stopped just past the threshold. His breath went still. The place looked almost exactly as he had left it. Tools hung on their hooks, their outlines marked on the pegboard. Oil stains mapped across the concrete floor. An old rolling stool sat where it always had, worn smooth by years of use. The workbench along the back wall held the same dents and burn marks, each one a story of something made or fixed or fought with. Dad moved toward the bench slowly. His hand rose and rested on the edge of the scarred wood. For a moment his shoulders straightened as if the weight he had been carrying found room to settle somewhere else. I watched him scan the tools, the shelves, the old parts. He reached for a wrench lying on the corner of the bench. He turned it once in his hand, thumb tracing the metal. This one never slipped, he murmured. His voice was soft but certain, the kind of certainty that comes from memory etched deeper than fear. I found another tool in the drawer and placed it beside him. He picked it up, studying the handle like it belonged to an old friend. The dust, the silence, the smell of oil and metal. All of it seemed to stitch something back together inside him. He walked toward the truck in the corner, the old project he never finished. The paint was chipped, the bumper rusted, but it stood there with the stubborn dignity of something built to last. Dad touched the fender fingers, brushing over a flaw in the metal he must have known by heart. He leaned closer, tapping one spot lightly. Engine is out of balance on the left bank, he said. Can hear it from here. He smiled a little, a real one, not the tired half-smile he had worn in the house these past months. I stood beside him in that dusty light, feeling the space shift around us. This was not just a room, not just old tools and old memories. It was a place where he had been fully himself, where his hands had shaped a life, bolt by bolt, job by job. And standing there now, he seemed to find a part of himself he thought had been taken from him. We walked the length of the garage together. Our footsteps echoed softly, joining the lingering hum of old work and old hours. Dad rested his hand on the hood of the truck, lowering his head in a private moment I did not interrupt. Outside, the sun dipped lower over the fields, casting long lines of light through the open door. Dust sparkled in the air, drifting between us and the fading afternoon. For the first time in a long while, it felt like we were not just defending what remained. We were reclaiming something that had almost slipped beyond reach. The evening air trailed behind us as we closed the garage door, carrying with it a sense of something quietly restored. Dad stood for a moment beside the truck, his hand resting on the warm metal as if he were greeting an old friend he thought he had lost. I watched the lines of his face soften in the fading light, the weight he had carried for months thinning into something almost gentle. In the days that followed, he moved through the house with a steadier step. There was still caution in the way he reached for the railing or paused before sitting down, but the fear that once lingered behind his eyes had begun to retreat. One morning he set out a folder on the kitchen table. The pages inside were weathered around the edges as though he had handled them many times without finding the courage to decide their fate. He sat across from me, his fingers resting lightly on the cover. "I want this land to mean something after I am gone," he said quietly. "It kept me upright for years. Maybe it can do the same for someone else." He told me he wanted to donate the land and the garage to a veterans group that ran programs for men rebuilding their lives after service. The idea came to him during one of his restless nights when he remembered the long miles he spent on the road talking to men who never quite found their way back home. There was no hesitation in his voice, only purpose grounded and clear. A week later, we loaded the truck with a couple of small bags and an old road atlas he insisted on bringing along. He traced a finger down the creases naming highways he knew by heart. I let him choose the route. The road had belonged to him long before it ever belonged to me. We left town before dawn. The sky was still a shade of pale blue and the headlights carved a narrow path through the empty streets. Dad watched the fields roll past, pointing every so often when he recognized a water tower or a stretch of fence he had repaired years ago. His voice carried the calm rhythm of memory, unforced and unhurried. Around midday, we stopped at a diner just off the interstate. The parking lot was almost empty, the kind of place where time settled slow and steady. Inside, the lights hummed softly and the smell of warm bread drifted through the air. Dad chose a booth near the window. He wrapped his hands around a cup of coffee without lifting it, studying the steam as it curled upward. There were nights after the stroke when I felt like I was disappearing. He said, his eyes still fixed on the cup. I would forget things I always knew, simple things. And every time it happened, I felt a little smaller. He paused, letting the words settle. I knew people were taking advantage of me, but I could not think straight enough to stop it. I was ashamed to tell you. I thought you deserved a father who could still stand on his own. His voice thinned with the last sentence. I felt something shift inside me, not sharp, not painful, just the quiet understanding of how much he had carried alone. On the road again, he rested his hand out the window, letting the wind brush against his fingers. The sky spread wide above us, scattered with thin clouds drifting over the hills. He leaned back and closed his eyes, listening to the steady hum of the engine. I could tell the sound comforted him, steady and familiar, like a piece of his old life still beating somewhere inside the noise. Near the state border, we pulled off at a lookout point overlooking a stretch of open land. The sun was dipping behind the hills, spilling warm color across the sky. Dad stepped out slowly, bracing himself on the door before walking toward the edge of the overlook. I stayed a step behind him, giving him space. He took a long breath, letting it out slowly. They thought I was helpless, he said with a faint smile. I guess they forgot I raised a son who wasn't. The wind lifted gently around us, carrying the warmth of the day's last light. I felt his words settle in the quiet, less like a declaration and more like a passing of something old and heavy that neither of us needed to hold anymore. We stood there until the sun slid behind the hills and the colors dimmed into the first cool shade of evening. When the air grew colder, he nodded to the truck. I helped him inside, easing the door shut with a soft thud. The engine turned over with a steady rumble. Dad adjusted the side mirror with a small instinctive motion, one that told me a part of him was returning, slow but sure. I rested my hands on the wheel and let the quiet settle between us in a way that no longer felt heavy. The road opened out ahead, long and calm beneath the deepening sky. I eased the truck forward, the headlights stretching into the dusk. We did not speak for miles. We did not need to. Somewhere along that stretch of highway, with the night settling gently around us, I felt something loosen inside me. Not triumph, not victory. Just a soft clarity that comes when a man finally understands where his path leads next. And as the stars began to gather above the windshield, I let the engine carry us forward steady and quiet into whatever awaited beyond the edge of the fading light.